All right, so welcome back, everyone. We're going to continue on with our show, I guess, and our conversation. I just want to begin, if you'll indulge me for a minute, that the work that I think is going on around the country, particularly in community colleges around equity and inclusion, is really, really important. And I had the pleasure of getting to know Jimmy through our conference travels. We kept bumping into each other, and that told me that the universe said we need to be doing some work together. And so we've presented at a couple of conferences. We're going to Chicago, I guess, in a couple weeks to do something else on this topic. And one of the things I appreciated about her, and I said this on our call, is that she is a very courageous person. She has a lot of courageous conversations, and one of the things I've learned from her is to do and say things with a spirit of openness, and she'll talk about that. But I just think this is a really important topic, and I really encourage you all to follow Jimmy's lead, because I think it's going to be a great conversation. So, and the rest of you, Sheryl Jensen is obviously on the NACCE board. She represents basically not only Canada, but the rest of the world, because she makes us global, and we appreciate her coming. And then, of course, EAB and Christina has so much good research to share. So I don't want to take up more time. I just want to thank you all and encourage you to be courageous and do your best, and I'm just excited that you're here.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that, Rebecca. Yeah, it is a pleasure again to lead another panel. This panel is very important to me. My undergraduate work was in cross-cultural communications. I lived overseas. I've lived in a lot of different places. I worked in HR and organizational development for many years. Worked with these types of issues relative to how you build organizations and address these systematically. So it's exciting to talk about this in relationship to entrepreneurship education and rolling entrepreneurship education out in a way that has diversity and inclusion as part of it. I am a big believer that the folks who are sitting in front of you right now are some of the people that can give us such a varied perspective on what it looks and feels like, which is why I'm super excited to have you as panelists. I just want you each to start with a brief overview of how you feel like when you first started out in the inclusion and diversity space, what was that like for you, and what transformation have you seen, right? So as part of kind of your intro story, I'd love for you to hit on that tone a little bit when you first start out. And we can actually start with you. That'd be great.
Thanks very much. So I'm Sheryl Jensen. I'm president of Algonquin College in Ottawa, Canada, and feel right at home with this weather. We had 3 tornadoes go through Ottawa about 2 weeks ago, which I think hasn't happened in something like 35 years, so you can blame the weather here on me, I guess. I started a long time ago in the college sector. I started in 1983 as a professor in chemical technology, and my first assignment was teaching 30 Libyan men upgrading physics and chemistry, and to me, that was the start of something brand new for me. I had never been in that situation, came from a white Caucasian background, and it developed my love for international education. Absolutely. I taught these students pretty much exclusively for 9 months and got to know their culture and their hopes and dreams, really. And so always worked in colleges that had a large, diverse population of, I would say, first of all, international backgrounds. Both colleges I worked at, Mohawk in Hamilton and Algonquin in Ottawa, had students from over 100 countries in the world. But I taught in an area that was very not diverse at all in terms of gender. I was the only female faculty member in physical sciences that was full-time for 13 years of my career. Some part-time women came and went. I was the first dean of technology in certainly most of the college sector in Ontario, followed by some quickly afterwards, and I'm the first female president at Algonquin. And so I take this diversity issue very, very seriously. I don't proclaim it all the time, but I know that that young women everywhere are watching me, and I take that responsibility very seriously. The other issue of diversity that I hope we can spend some time on today is our Aboriginal population in Canada. It's the largest growing youth population in Canada. And it is a population with huge issues in terms of poverty, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and not having their participation rates in post-secondary education where they need to be. And so I hope we can talk about that a little bit more today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that, Sheryl. And now, Christine, we've chatted quite a bit. We had a nice theoretical discussion last night over drinks. That's the best time to talk about theory, right? No one wants to do it when you're defending your dissertation. So it was really exciting to chat with you, and I want to hear your sort of intro into the space.
Okay, so I think that my path was a little bit more untraditional, to say the least. So when I was 17, I actually got married, and my husband joined the military, and we ended up over in Belgium. While I was there, I started working for University of Maryland University College, and for the next decade of my career, I served military students. So I never really saw it as serving a diverse, certainly they were a diverse student population, but I didn't see them as disadvantaged or struggling, because within, when we're in the weeds, you don't necessarily see it from that perspective. After we came back to the United States, I ultimately ended up working at Northern Virginia Community College, and I think that that was the first point at which I really saw myself as playing a role in diversity and inclusion. Again, I saw myself as an advocate, and later when I did my dissertation work, I converted that word slightly to an ally, and so it's really about trying to provide that information and that support to students to make sure that we can help them to get across the finish line. So I think that that's been my introduction, and across time, what I've observed is there's more conversation around this where, if we look back 15, 20 years ago, it seemed more like it was a hidden issue and people didn't really talk about disadvantages across different student populations. And over the last few years, we're identifying microgroups that really need a lot of support in order to make sure that they can be successful.
Great. And Jimmy, you and I have chatted a couple of times on a couple of different issues. Hope we'll be able to work more on my research. Guys, I'm working on my dissertation, so if my mind just all of a sudden switches into entrepreneurial self-efficacy discussion, it's just because it's flooded my synaptic pathways. Apologies for that. But I'd love to hear from you, Jimmy, just the way you've seen your career progress and how inclusion and diversity has really affected that or been a component of it. We'll put it that way.
Hi, I'm Jimmy Choi from Arizona State University. Just to preface this a little bit, I lead our entrepreneurship and innovation programs at ASU, which is a set of student-facing, faculty-facing, and community-facing programs. And I joined ASU in November of 2015. Certainly, before I was at ASU, I had a career at New York University, Columbia University, United Nations. There was always at these kind of intersections of entrepreneurial new public-private partnerships or kind of startups within existing organizations. So in many ways, I was an entrepreneur in addition to being an entrepreneur, where my first startup company that I worked with was in the late 90s. It was a dot-com company. I think I was the 6th employee hired. It was founded by 4 students that were alumni from NYU. And at the time, 20 some odd years ago, it wasn't as common, the idea that you would have spin-outs that were coming out of a university. And I have to admit that even with my lived experience as an Asian American female, I didn't actually think quite a lot about what diversity and inclusion meant until I came to a place like ASU. And the reason why I say that, and bravery, Dr. Corbin was saying, right, bravery, it's a little bit easier when you know you're not necessarily going to be recorded and broadcast on Facebook Live or something like that. So within this cone of silence, I will say one of the things that drove me to ASU that bothered me so much about my career until that point had been that diversity and inclusion was always looked at from a deficit model. What is it that we need to do to help people overcome? How do we help fill up these people that need extra help? And I'll give you one specific example. I was working at NYU at the time, fantastic organization, largest private university in the country. But they would send out this press release every fall that always made me feel crestfallen. And the press release always looked like this. Banner, record number of applications. NYU achieves the highest number of applications ever. The subtext and the subhead to that was the highest number of rejections. So the idea that I found so pessimistic was that universities were all in this arms race of selectivity, of actually positioning themselves as organizations that you could know how excellent they were based on who they excluded. So the other side of that headline, banner number of applications, was banner number of rejections. And that banner number of rejections goes into U.S. News and World Report, your rankings and everything else like that. Whereas ASU was a very different organization. It's in our charter. It explicitly says we measure ourselves by who we include and how they succeed. And so that was an opportunity for me to take my lived experiences, kind of uncomfortable microaggressions throughout my entire life, throughout my entire career, and actually say, well, how do I get to be a person in charge and work with a president, like many of you, who are also in charge of making those decisions and are in charge of making those principles and then actualizing them every day. So in my case, through entrepreneurship, through the programs that we deliver, through the people that we support, through the even the perceptions that we're able to help impact, that's something that I get to live every single day.
That's great. I wanted to go over a little bit of information that kind of sets a context for where we are and a context for what we have before us. I see a couple of you guys have entered some things there. Feel free to do that. You can get to it by going to your web browser on your phone and just submitting that in. But that's just a question that's out there right now, and I'll pull some of those things in and have discussions around those too, because I think they're particularly relevant. Anytime we're in a room of people, I want people's minds to be engaged with this conversation that we're having, and this is just one way for me to do that. Just to flip through this just for a second. So according to this slide, which I do really love, this straightforward organizational and development way of thinking about diversity, which is diversity means all the ways in which we differ. Right? So if you think about diversity, that's what that looks like. Inclusion puts the concept diversity into action by creating an open, inviting environment that encourages involvement and respect. So that's how those two words sort of fit together when I'm thinking about them in this panel, and hopefully when we're talking about them, we'll show those types of relationships too. The other thing I wanted to go over here, which I think is also important, is it's always nice to have a framework to talk about things. And that framework, whenever you're discussing this particular issue here, is you're talking about the work of, I don't know where my slides went. My slides disappeared. Okay, there we go. So when we're talking about this, we're talking about principles, things like domains, short-term outcomes, and people. So this is a cycle when we're looking at these components. And I think as we discover the parts and pieces of this through our discussion here, we'll be able to talk about the ways that inclusion and diversity can really contribute to something in particular. And I'd like to start this conversation by digging into when we talk about domains of impact or domains of impact relative to these three words that we've been talking about so far, which is equity, diversity, and inclusion. So if you talk about equity, you mean something. If you talk about diversity, you mean something. And if you talk about inclusion, you mean something. We tend to think of them as one thing, but they're not, in fact, right? So I'd love to hear ways that you kind of split those things apart to make them part of the entrepreneurial conversation that you're having on your campus.
So I'm gonna focus right now on what we're doing with what we're really trying to do with our Indigenous population. We have just opened a center this year. We call it the DARE District. It's kind of cool. I like it. It stands for Discovery, Applied Research, and Entrepreneurship, but it also sets a connotation of where we're going as a college at Algonquin, that we dare to be different. You know, we can play around with that quite a bit. And one of the things that we are daring to do is to focus differently on our Aboriginal population, and it really speaks to what I just heard, which is very often you hear that we need to help our Indigenous population, we need to fix them, we need to make them whole. And if you're not familiar with the absolutely horrible way that Canada has treated our Aboriginal population in the past, I'll just give you a couple of stats I think that for me were eye-opening and absolutely made me feel ashamed. And this was not that long ago. The federal government, started working on something called the Truth and Reconciliation Report, and that was to find the truth in what was happening during my lifetime with our Aboriginal population, and how do we reconcile that, and that we can't really get to the reconciliation until we all know what the truth is. There was none of this in our history books when I was going to school. I went to a display of the residential schools, and I'll talk about those in a minute, and this is where I think in good intention, with good intent, children were taken away from their parents from Aboriginal communities and sent away to school to teach the students the white way, the domestic way. And you know, when you hear people talk about, can you imagine in your own community if all the children were taken out on trains, the quiet that would be in these communities, and picture then not teaching those young people their language and what that does to civilization. Well, that's what we were doing. And I went to a display and they showed little things that the children could have taken with them, and maybe one or two things, maybe their moccasins and a hairbrush. And what struck me was the suitcase that these little things were being displayed in. I had that suitcase as a little girl. So these were things that were happening as I was growing up and had no idea that they were happening. And so this led to all kinds of issues with abuse. If you can imagine sending your own kids to a school where 1 out of 5 children died in school. I mean, we wouldn't accept that if one child died at our kids' school, I don't think. So when we were building our DARE district, we decided to focus on Indigenous entrepreneurship. And what that meant was, how can we teach Indigenous people about entrepreneurship? We believe that they were the original entrepreneurs and that they were living in their own communities with their own electrical grid and their own businesses, and how can we learn what that meant? And so instead of, as I said, instead of us figuring out how to do it, we hired an executive director of Truth and Reconciliation, and it's a young Aboriginal man who's helping us through this. And what we're learning is that the Aboriginal way of consensus building is not a bad way to run your college, and so we're changing the way that we hold meetings to have more of an Aboriginal focus and a circle and involving those discussions. And the thirst for this out of when we talked earlier about negative vibes from doing something different, this was embraced by our group, so much by our student population that our student association donated $1 million to our DARE district to have Aboriginal artifacts all of the way through the center. So this is something that we're just learning. We're certainly not anywhere near we need to be. It's going to be a long journey, but I would say that that's a difference between inclusion and equity, where we've learned that equity doesn't mean that we teach our Aboriginal youth how to do it. They are teaching us how to do things differently.
So I will answer very briefly. So that, and I'm actually going to give it over to because I think that you have a really great perspective on this.
Yeah, and that's fine, guys. We're not going, as you saw from the last panel, we don't go down the line per se. So yeah, jump in. Go ahead, Jim.
For us, one of the things that I found is that inclusive practices, equitable practices lead to diversity. And it's just as simple as that. The idea being that how do you take everyday decision making, and maybe I'll just give a brief story as an illustration. I was at a national summit last week, and it was a specific focus on inclusion and entrepreneurship, and it was a national program with program directors from all across the universities, all across the country. And one of the things that I found is that even though the conversation was about inclusion and entrepreneurship, there were numbers of panels, there were numbers of things happening, including one, and it was a kickoff of an inclusion panel. And there were 5 program directors that were invited to sit on the stage and talk about their perspective. And no offense, but it turned out to be that there were 5 white male, middle-aged program directors. We need our white male program directors. We need everybody to be at the stage and the table. But what wound up happening is that it set the stage for the rest of the conversation. And it became much more about holding a power and ceding a power as opposed to sharing a power. And equity is much more about fairness in the idea that you have inherent power in your own spheres of domain and influence, whether they're about programs and about people. And then having inclusive practices, even small things such as saying, is this panel representative of the audience that we're speaking to, the allies that we're trying to gain, the programs that we're trying to support? And if the answer is no, then you need to take that step back and say, this practice is not going to lead to diversity. It's actually going to lead to more alienation. Now, on balance as a whole, the rest of it I think worked out well. But there were moments like that, and you could feel that sort of freeze happening in the room. We had HBCUs in the room, we had presidents of HSIs in the room, and there was this little bit of, we're going to be talked at again. as opposed to we're part of that conversation. So for me, equitable practices lead to, inclusive practices lead to diversity.
I like that. And I want to give you a moment to just chat about something in particular here when we talk about these things. Christine, when you were doing your work and sort of working in that space of talking about how do you define the truth that needs to be discovered and explored relative to that? I mean, you talked for a few minutes and gave some amazing examples of how Indigenous people have a history that we have forgotten. So what is that uncovering process for truth that you've seen happen when you've used different techniques?
So what I was going to do is, in true presidential strategy, I was going to answer the question I wanted, which was the one that was posted a moment ago about the difference between equity and equality and the challenge with faculty. That was an internal question that came from here somewhere? Yep. Okay.
Yeah, we can take that one.
Okay.
So jump on it.
All right, I will. So one of the exercises that I used to use in my classroom to be able to tell that story to faculty or to my students, and I think that it applies really well for faculty members, is to have everybody in the room. My class typically had 45 students in it, so you can picture 5 rows, 9 deep of students, and I would have them all pull out a piece of paper, and some of you may have heard of this exercise, so. Bear with me, if you will. One of the things that I would ask them to do is to pull out that piece of paper, wad it up, and then I would put a trash can on my desk, and I would say, okay, anybody who gets a basket on their first try, you get an A. And so you can't get up from your seat. You must stay in your seat. But if you shoot this piece of paper in and you get the basket, then you've earned an A in my course. And of course, it immediately began all the questions of, well, that's not fair. The students from the back were really frustrated. The students in the front row thrilled because now they have a chance to get an A. I will tell you, of course, they never actually earned that A by doing something so low level. But it is a really great way of drawing out that difference between equality and equity and helping people to understand that, everybody had a shot at the A, but people don't necessarily understand what the starting points of many of our students do to affect their ultimate outcomes. And I think that's a really important piece to bring to faculty members is that, it may feel unfair to, it's the same conversation we've had with students with disabilities in the past, right? It might feel unfair to give a certain student more time on a test or to give a student, the opportunity to test without other people in the classroom. But the fact of the matter is that that's how we make it equitable for that student. That's what gives them the fair shot to succeed in your course. So that's what we do. And I think the same thing happens a lot of the time when we're talking about other student populations.
Great, and you're spot on when you talk about those pieces. My prior question, we'll jump right over that, just because I want to make sure we get through a certain amount of content, and I know we're all on tight timelines. Flights are getting delayed. Weather is weather. So 11, right now, what we really want to focus on is short-term outcomes. How do you obtain short-term outcomes relative to driving diversity and inclusion in your different spheres of influence that you all have up here, because you're all at different places? Yeah.
So just briefly, I wanted to mention there are your spheres of influence, and as presidents, one of the most important things that you can do for people like me, right? I report to a president. I love his vision. I love the institutional vision of the university. The wind at my back is when presidents say 2 things. One, that entrepreneurship matters, and that 2, inclusion in entrepreneurship matters. And so if you have the ability to publicly declare these things, to align with me, to ally with me, to give me some spotlight on the work that we're doing, that's a free thing. It doesn't cost you anything. And as a president, that's something that you can do for people like me who, by the way, right, we're knocking ourselves out, not only to serve our students, but also, frankly, to impress our presidents and say we're doing a great job for you. So that's an easy thing that you can do. An easy thing that we do is that we make sure, whether it's our programs that we're looking at, is it a diversity of industries that we're serving? So as an example, socioeconomic diversity. A lot of attention is being paid to high-tech scalable startups. Not as much attention is being paid to Main Street entrepreneurship, to the mom and pop shops, to the service industries, to the things that are happening that make communities vibrant as a whole. So we look for socioeconomic diversity in terms of industries that we're serving. Anytime we're delivering or developing new programs, we want to be clear that that's one, that's meeting an actual need, and 2, that no one else is doing it, and therefore that's a gap that we ought to be filling. The second thing is on people. So I really think about it in terms of programs, people, and perceptions. People, when we're hiring in program managers or we're hiring program coordinators or we're asking faculty to be the spokespeople or we're looking for panelists, the same thing has to happen. Is this set of people reflective of the community we're serving? Reflective, not representative. Representative means when you have token, let's put a female on the panel, let's put an underrepresented minority, versus reflective. If your community is 30% Hispanic, 30% of your program leadership should be Hispanic. If you're serving 48% women and you only have one woman on your leadership team, that really speaks to, again, the idea of being reflective of your community. And then finally on perceptions. The last piece on perceptions, and it's an easy thing to do, we audit all of our marketing materials. We audit, even, and I can't help it now, I can't unsee it anymore. When I'm sitting and I see people put up slides and they talk about, our programs are diverse and this is what we're doing, and somehow there's always like all male teams. Or the big winning check is always that young male student who looks like an engineer. It's never somebody sitting in a wheelchair or an underrepresented minority person, or there's, right? So even on small things like how do you manage perceptions, it's a really simple thing to do to audit your marketing materials and even audit your own slides when you're giving presentations. At this national summit last week, it happened too, where they were talking about these diverse programs and 68% were women, and yet I noticed every single picture had all male teams in them. And there's such a cognitive dissonance that happens, and it becomes inauthentic. Then you start to say, well, it's just lip service, as opposed to who's appointed, who's selected, who gets the microphone, who's hired. And at ASU, I know many times we've gone sometimes months with a vacant position because we say the pool just didn't turn up. It's not possible that in Maricopa County, with the diversity that we have in Arizona, that we haven't seen this pool. And so the burden gets turned around. We did a bad job recruiting. Equality is when you say, well, the posting was available for everyone. Equity is when you say, but did you go and recruit with the Arizona Hispanic Chamber of Commerce? Did you go and talk to the Native American Chamber of Commerce? Did you go to the Black Chamber and say, we have these positions available? Do you know anybody that wants to be mentors with us? Do you know anybody? Again, that's the difference. Equality is everybody's allowed to apply for our jobs. Equity is actually going out and making deliberate recruitment efforts.
Yeah, I feel that's true. When I worked in HR and organizational development, one of the pieces that hit home for me was that I had to make the effort to strategically design where I went to get inclusion, to get a part of what diversity looked like. Right now in my entrepreneurship degree program that I'm coordinating, I'm looking at the advisory boards, I'm looking at industries. I've got like this massive grid. I was talking to Sheryl about this. I was like, I got this huge grid of all these industries that are potential industries, right? And we're scoring them about what should be important because we're in New York City. You could pick any industry that you want there, right? So the question becomes, what do you want to do? Do you want to do light manufacturing? Do you want to do finance? Do you want to do technology? Where do you want to go? So what I really decided is I need to make a full, long list of all those different groups and ethnicities and make a strategic goal to build an advisory board that reaches out to those particular places. And I don't think we do that. Oftentimes, what I do is I see, when I do a Google search, which organizations pop up, and then I start working with those, or my student assistant will look at certain things, and that'll happen that way. And it's just not systematic enough, as far as I'm concerned. And that's something that I think is important, too.
Yeah, so I would have to agree too. And one of the things that I was thinking about was I tend to look at low-income student populations in particular. And when I think about the opportunities that we could instill for those students, I think about things like work study. And I was really excited yesterday when we heard, I believe it was with Hawking College, where they have really invested a lot of money into their work study program. And the beauty of that, from my perspective, is that it's giving people real-world skills. So in my college, at Nova, our work studies made about $10 to $11, depending on what the job was. But the value of that was that they were getting tangible skills. So rather than necessarily working in McDonald's or retail, which are great professions as well, but they're not necessarily getting those professional office experiences that they might gain on campus. So I really like that idea of leveraging our work study dollars to try to provide more opportunities to our students, and then also reaching out into our communities to make sure that we are, when we are looking for internship opportunities for traditional aged college students, that some of those internship opportunities are in more diverse and unique organizations, not necessarily going with what's easy, but going with something that reflects our local communities.
That's great. I want to jump out into the audience. If there's a question right now relative to what we've covered so far, I'd love to step out and do a quick Phil Donahue moment. Let me know. Don't be shy. Don't be shy. Anyone have any questions about diversity and inclusion, what it's meant to you, if you've had specific challenges that you'd like to propose, or an example that you feel like would drive home what we're talking about?
I have a question about connecting with Native American populations. I'm from Oregon, and we have a pretty significant Native population there, but they don't come to our college, and we reach out to them, and at the executive level, we interact a lot. But below that, there's very little interaction, and so I'm wondering, how do you break through those layers?
That's a great question, and there's no simple answer to that question. Many of the different bands, I'll call them, and the Aboriginal population doesn't recognize the Canada-US border, so many of them flow across the borders. They have different feelings about any of this, whether it's called an intrusion or some form of help. And so that's why I think really spending the time, although it seems to take an awful lot of time, and we as A-plus personalities don't like to spend that amount of time on anything, we need to just listen and figure out what is the truth, because it certainly isn't our version of the truth. And that could take, I don't know, days, months, years even, before we make any kind of progress. And so, I think back to when I was teaching in a lab, and I had a student, an Aboriginal young woman, who at the time I knew she was an Aboriginal young woman, but I didn't spend any time with her that was any different than any other student, and she never even raised her head when she was talking to me. She didn't even look at me. And she was in my class for about 5 weeks and then just disappeared. And when I think now, at Algonquin, we have the fastest growing Aboriginal population in the province, in our student body, largely because Ottawa is the capital of the country, and there's a direct flight from Nunavut right to Ottawa. The Cree population from Quebec comes to Ottawa. But many of those young people end up homeless because if they don't get what they need from us, they don't want to go back home because they're seen as a failure. So we need to work as a community, as a city, as a group of service providers to see how we can solve this. I say this with all humility. The reason why I hired Ron as my executive director was I told him, I don't know how to do this. I'm certainly not the person to do it. You have to help me to do this. And so it's just a time thing, and it's not something where we need to be feeling badly if we're not making much progress very quickly.
Great points, great points. I want to take us now toward the industry side, where business, we're in entrepreneurship, we're in entrepreneurship education. We've talked about creating jobs. We've talked about connecting to industry as a component of how community colleges are working. The inclusion and diversity and equity questions, when you're talking about the actual blueprint and footprint of these industries, is not usually inclusive. It's not usually diverse. Do you think, and have you seen great examples of where community colleges can become the champions for diversity and inclusion and actually push it out instead of trying to just connect with the communities themselves? That's one aspect, of course, that's important, but the industry side.
So in my experience at Nova, we did see that on a number of different scales. One that I think of in particular is a training organization that was a very small organization in Fairfax, which is just outside a few of our campuses, honestly. And one of the things that we saw was we could amplify their voice in ways that they couldn't do on their own. And so being able to feed some of our students through their training program and then have our students connect with our local employers through that training opportunity, I think really did help to change the conversation. It identified somebody who was doing really great work supporting students who needed needed additional information and additional support, and then connecting them with our local employers by using the larger voice that we as an institution had.
May I add to that? I have to give a shout out to Maricopa Community College District because we have two presidents here from PVCC and South Mountain Community College. What we've seen in Greater Arizona and Greater Phoenix, which is one of the fastest growing, Maricopa is, I think, easily one of the fastest growing counties in the country, is by partnering and having a full spectrum of all of the organizations that are available. Together working with industry, I think, certainly helps. The idea that everything from career and technical education all the way through 4-year, all the way through sponsored research, that full spectrum is of more value than the kind of monolithic institutions that you would work with in other cases. Let me give you one concrete example. We worked together with the Greater Phoenix Economic Council, the Arizona Commerce Authority, and then a number of the Maricopa Community Colleges District, and ASU and U of A, to approach a significant potential employer. We just announced 3 weeks ago that Infosys is coming to Phoenix and that they're bringing 1,000 new jobs. One of the centers of excellence is going to be located in Phoenix. About 10 months ago, that was a very remote possibility. They were going after Purdue University, whereas they announced one big partnership with Purdue. It seemed kind of like, who wants to be in Arizona? It's hot 6 months out of the year. It's not so easy to get to, this and that. But what we did is we were able to bring a full spectrum of support to Infosys and have that conversation in a way that they later said they hadn't received in any other city yet. They hadn't seen that in any other city. So my appeal would be the idea to reach out to all the other universities in your hometowns and be able to say, well, how do we partner? Clearly, ASU alone would not have been appealing enough for Infosys to come and to bring one of their major centers of excellence into Greater Phoenix without that full spectrum of partnership. So it's one of the things I just wanted to mention specifically when it comes to industry.
And I want, because we have a 4-year college and a 2-year college on the panel right now, I want you to talk about the differences that you see between inclusion and diversity, between working in a community college environment versus a 4-year college, briefly. I know we're at a community college symposium, but I want to take advantage of Jimmy's mind, right? And of course, part of that too is really to look at ways that we as a group can work with those parts.
So Canada and Ontario has a different educational system altogether from what you have in the United States, and it's different in every province, which just adds to the complexity. In Ottawa, there are 2 colleges. Algonquin, we're large, we're English speaking, we've got about 22,000 students. We've got smaller campuses about an hour and 2 hours away. We've got a French speaking college, La Cité, only French speaking, about 6,000 students. We've got 2 big universities. We've got University of Ottawa and Carleton University. So we've done something that we're kind of, you talked about branding earlier. We're calling ourselves Education City. So where else in Canada could you have that combination of educational institutions? So we've all signed an agreement that we will work together on new partnerships in terms of personalized education, bringing new companies into Ottawa. Ottawa is a government town, but it's also a very strong high-tech town. And so high-tech's always looking for new talent. I know that's not the best word, but they are looking for talent. And they don't care if these young people have a college diploma, a college degree, a university degree. Some of them don't even care if they have a credential. They need a certain amount of skills. So we're trying to work together to say, okay, how do we work on our own goals in terms of our own diversity, which we all have, but how do we bring that to the businesses in Ottawa who know that the more diverse their workforce is, the better their outcomes are. And so we're actually starting to get quite a bit of traction. The mayor is talking about Education City, and it's bringing, Amazon just built a new branch in Ottawa, and they're talking about more. So it seems to be working.
That's great. When we talk about ventures and venture-backed opportunities, looking at the statistics, less than 10% of venture-backed companies actually have female partners. So that's a huge discrepancy between the real world and what's happening in this creation of entrepreneurship. What are some ways that you found that you've been able to attract women into the space of entrepreneurship and or just activate their entrepreneurial spirit that already exists?
So it's funny, last week, and I hate to keep coming back to this because it was thought-provoking, the person on the stage said that only 1% of venture capital goes to actually female-led, right? So not that there's only a female founder on their team. And for underrepresented, it was 2% for women, 1% for underrepresented minority. And the premise was, in order to change that, we would need to start 2,000 new companies per year in order to have more of a pipeline. And the part that really bothered me was that actually I don't think that's true. I think there are lots of women-led companies, there are lots of women founders, there are lots of underrepresented minorities leading companies. I think the problem is they're being overlooked. They're not being funded. So there's two parts of the equation. One is that yes, we need to grow the pipeline, but two, we actually need to put more attention on the companies that already exist and they're struggling and that are much shorter runways. They're running out of runway much faster. So one of the things that we've done is that, again, it's this question before they came up on the prior panel, is celebrate entrepreneurs, right? Celebrate, there's a campaign out right now by the Case Foundation, it's called Faces of Founders. And the idea being that there can be a diversity, not only, again, in terms of ethnic diversity and racial diversity, but also in diversity in industry, diversity in abilities, diversity in geography. And my recommendation is to take advantage of all of that as much as possible. Knowing that there's a difference between ethnic diversity and geographic diversity, that's okay. You and I can know that, but we should all squint a little bit and take advantage of the fact that there's attention being paid right now to geographic diversity and industrial diversity, ethnic diversity as a whole, and be able to say, how do we put more momentum behind it and really celebrate people who are at the forefront. There's no need for any of us to reinvent the wheel. There are multiple people out there right now. Miriam Rivera, former Google General Counsel, just started a new fund that's for women-led entrepreneurs. Dell's Women's Entrepreneurship Network is significant. There's so many things out there right now. The Case Foundation is doing great work. So what we've been trying to do is amplify the things that are already happening, the burgeoning spotlights, and frankly, some of these venues have much bigger celebrity spotlight than I have, and that's okay. I'll take advantage of it. I couldn't pay somebody enough money to put my words in their mouths and have them be the ones that are saying it. That's fantastic. I'm happy to do that. So one of the things is, frankly, it's not a question of, you need to offer more programs for women with childcare. Yes, there's maybe some of that, and that's true as a pragmatic thing, but there's also things that you could do right away very specifically, which is celebrate the things that are happening, celebrate the successes that are already there, and stop overlooking entrepreneurs in your community that already exist and deserve to be celebrated, and start working with them to say, how do we collectively put you at the front of, again, a lot of modeling behavior. A couple of people have said it before, right? You can't be what you can't see. And that there's a lot of truth in that. And part of that means celebrating the women and letting them actually be the advocates and the voices as well, and less of the, we need specific programs for specific women at specific times of days and specific times of night. Yes, there's a little bit of that, but there's also more of celebrating what's already existing.
When you look at, and you talked briefly about this, when you look at the funding opportunities and ways to really drive this with various initiatives, what types of organizations might be most helpful in your particular areas as far as connecting community colleges, entrepreneurship, and the other pieces? Yeah, there are foundations, but which ones? Yeah, there might be social venture capital or social entrepreneurship capital or any type of impact funds, things like that. Which ones really stand out for you?
So again, being from Virginia and just hearing the comment from one of the VCCS schools yesterday, I really do have to fall on that and say that the state can be a great advocate, and I'll let each of you speak to specific funders. But I keep thinking about the Workforce Credentials Grant that is available in Virginia now, and I was part of the workforce development team at that time that was being launched. And one of the things that we knew immediately was it was going to completely change the kinds of students that were coming in our doors. Historically, we had only had students who could self-pay. There was no kind of financial aid available for workforce credentials, and therefore it was people that were wealthy and oftentimes already college educated that were going to be coming in to train. So when we started the Workforce Credentials Grant, one of the things that we did immediately was we started to think about how these students' experiences might be different, and then also connecting with some of the counseling support that was available on campus to make sure students had were able to have some of the conversations that they needed to have about the different resources that were necessary in order to help them succeed, whether that was childcare or whether it was transportation or another challenge like that. So I think that ends up being a very important part of the conversation, is that it's another push that I make with the College Promise programs as well, that we can't just focus on access. Access is certainly important, but we need to make sure that we're setting our students up to succeed once they come through our doors. And I think that oftentimes that's overlooked in our efforts to have a representative population on campus. But we need to make sure that everybody can succeed, and I think right now we're struggling to do that.
So I'll just build on that, a couple of comments. I do think that there are lots of groups locally that, often we look for the big funders and the big founders. We've got I don't know if you know the Weston Foundation here in the States, but it's big in Canada, who have just given Algonquin a huge award for us to work on the trades and building entrepreneurs in the trades. And so that's been something that's been very beneficial to us. However, at the local level, economic development groups within our cities are really starting to look at us as to how can we build that spirit of entrepreneurship in our students, and how can we build that diversity through that. So they're really paying attention now to what they need to keep these people in their city for city building. That's what community colleges do. So yeah, we need to look at these big donors, but there's also that local flavor that I think we just can't ignore. They're often smaller pieces of the pie, so it takes more work to get them all aligned, but it's an incredibly successful way of doing it. The other, with the underrepresented groups, and it could be our Aboriginal population, it could be those in extreme poverty. And I think it was Johnny up here earlier who said, there's a fear of coming to college. Well, that's more prevalent than we like to think. And it's not even just a fear of going to school, it's going to that big school on the hill. And so I can remember a session I went to down in Hamilton, where I used to work, where the life expectancy of our young people varied by 30 years by postal code. That's how bad the poverty was in some areas. And I asked one young man who looked like he'd been in jail the night before, I said, do you want to finish your high school? He said, yes. Well, come to the college. I don't belong there. So I looked at him, I said, what if we came to you? And he looked at me and said, my mother would be so proud. So we started little schools within those areas to at least get them to the level where they felt confident to go to the college. And I think that's where this issue of inclusion really, when we start walking our words, is when the inclusion issue will start to move the needle on that.
I'm so happy you said that, because even before the question about, the Native American communities and they won't come to us, the idea, well, you go to them. And go to them with the idea that if you're invited and you have something to actually offer, as opposed to saying, oh, we just want to make sure that you get involved and you're a group that we think is left out at the moment. And